Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of China Throughlines. And it is my great pleasure today to be able to have a chat with Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom of University of California, Irvine. My name is Paul Pickowicz. I'm a professor at University of California, San Diego. Jeff has a new book out, a very important book, a very interesting book, extremely clearly written. Really, it's for anybody. And it's called Hong Kong on the Brink. And as we all know, just listening to the news or reading the newspapers, Hong Kong is in the news almost all the time. Something big is happening there. And that's what his book is about. And that's what we want to talk to him about. The book ends in narrative terms on October 1, 2019. In other words, about a year ago on October 1, 2019. It so happens I was there in Hong Kong on October 1, 2019, and I stayed for a little bit longer, and I saw firsthand everything that was going on in the street. It was extremely disturbing to witness the violence, and this is a place that I love. I've been going to Hong Kong on a regular basis since 1970, so that's 50 years ago. But let's just start out with a number of obvious questions. Jeff Wasserstrom is one of the leading historians of modern China in the world. And one of his specialties is the role of students in various political movements over a 100-year period. And our theme here is China Throughlines, and we're trying to connect things going on today to things that have been going on in the past. And the Hong Kong case is a very good one. So I want to start off by welcoming Jeff to the series and to ask him a question about the role of students. He mentions 1919 in China. He mentions 1989 in China. And then here we are, 2019 in Hong Kong. Consistently, we're seeing students out on the street in modern Chinese history. And I'd like to ask him the question, why does he think that's the case? And what patterns, if any, does he see there in the activity of students?
That's a great question. And it's a real pleasure to be talking to you, Paul, because I once spent a year at San Diego being your colleague, getting to teach with you. And one of the first things that I wrote about student protests was with Joe Esherick, your colleague for so long there, and building up San Diego's program together. So it's perfect to be talking about this kind of topic with you. I see a couple of through lines about student activists, and I think it's important to think of students in China in two categories. One is youth, representing the youth of the nation or of the political community in Hong Kong's case, and also intellectuals in the making. I think there's a long tradition of intellectuals having a role in politics in China that can be special. And the idea is that when students are taking to the streets, they're representing youth, the next generation, and they're also representing scholars in the making. And both of these add a kind of legitimacy to what they're doing that isn't always present in, say, the American context, where sometimes people say, what are students doing getting involved in politics? That just isn't something that you hear in the Chinese context. In another kind of through line is that I think in 1919, 1989, and 2019, though the protesters took to the streets for different reasons, they all had a sense that the political community was being misgoverned, and that they needed to try to speak out to try to get their community better governed, whether that community was the nation or a city. But the other thing that happened was that once they were on the streets, what kept the protests going was anger at police brutality, anger at the idea that the authorities were not treating them as legitimate actors on the street who were inspired by patriotic motivations, but were disparaging them as troublemakers. And so in each case, what kept the protests going and what led people of other social groups to join them on the streets was in part a sense that the authorities were not allowing protests to take place the way they should, and a sense that the students, the youth on the streets, had the moral high ground vis-a-vis the people in power. So even though it was in very different contexts, I think those are some through lines that connect each place, each time.
Great, thank you very much. I get information. I like to be updated on Hong Kong all the time, and I've had many former undergraduate students who finish with UC San Diego. They go back to Hong Kong, and then we stay in touch, and they send me material all the time. And it's really quite something to get these emotions and feelings expressed through emails and so forth. Your book is called Hong Kong on the Brink. On the brink of what, though? What is it on the brink of? And I'd like you to elaborate on that. In some ways, it deals with the question of what kind of place will Hong Kong be in the future? It's on the brink of something. What's it going to be like there in the future? How different or how similar to other cities in China is Hong Kong going to be? So what's the brink?
So I'll just tell you that the actual title of the book is Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink. It was going to be called simply Hong Kong on the Brink. That was the working title. And then it turned out there was another book out called Hong Kong on the Brink, which was about 1967, another time when Hong Kong was on the edge of momentous changes. So we had to add the vigil, which played into the fact that the June 4th vigil in honor of the martyrs of 1989 takes place in Hong Kong and not other places. But that's actually one of the things Hong Kong's on the brink about. Hong Kong for years has been the only place in the People's Republic of China where you could have a large-scale gathering to mark the anniversary of June 4th. So it's on the brink. It felt like it was on the brink of being a place where you wouldn't be able to do that anymore. And this year, 2020, for the first time, protesters were not given the legal right to hold a memorial on June 4th. The pandemic was used as the excuse for banning it, but it seems quite likely that going forward, one way that Hong Kong is being made to be more like mainland cities is by suppressing the kind of right to protest on that taboo date. In Macau, you have in the past been able to hold vigils. There have been smaller ones. Macau has been pulled more into the mainland's orbit. And in some ways, what Beijing wants to do is pull Hong Kong to become more like Macau, which is a place that's different from a mainland city, but different only or mainly in the way that economics work, the way that money is made and spent. So Hong Kong, since 1997, since it's become part of the PRC as a special administrative region, has been different from mainland cities in a whole host of ways, having to do with civil society, the public sphere, education, and what the mainland would like to do, I think, what the Communist Party under Xi Jinping wants to do, is move Hong Kong, and this is what Hong Kong's on the brink of being, more like another mainland city. So that's what I had in mind primarily.
Okay, that's good. That's clear. And I'm interested in the book ends effectively on October 1, 2019. A whole year has passed, and as you've already indicated, what's dominated much of this current year is COVID. And what kind of impact has that had on an already very complicated situation in Hong Kong? Would you comment on that?
Sure. I think one thing is, so the one country, two systems idea has undergirded the way Hong Kong is supposed to function. It's supposed to be part of a country, China, but have some kind of system that's different. And the tension has always been, is the system the economic system or economic plus political system that's different? And also it's sort of, what do local people feel they get from benefit from being part of one country? And to what extent does having two systems protect them from things? So with COVID, this came into sharp relief because clearly when the pandemic was surging on the mainland, the local authorities decided that they would take their cues from Beijing as to how to treat that and keep the border open with the mainland, even though local health officials were calling for strictures on the border going across. If the two systems part were strong, the local authorities in Hong Kong would listen to local public health officials, not to Beijing. But in this case, they took their cues from Beijing, which led to a lot of popular discontent. As soon as South Korea became a hotbed center of COVID, the border with South Korea was closed. So this brought home, I think, to some locals that for in something that really mattered to their local life, all that mattered to the local government was the one country part, not the two systems part. So COVID led to a ban on large scale gatherings, and there has been a scaling back of street protests. That's clear. But there hasn't been a diminishment of the kinds of grievances that get people onto the streets, like that sense that the local government isn't listening to them, but rather taking their orders from Beijing. So I think, you know, that we've got to always think, what do local people think is the benefit of being part of one country, and what are the risks? COVID has shown what the risks are. In the past, sometimes people have seen the benefits. In 2008, when the Olympics were held in Beijing, a lot of people in Hong Kong were really excited about being part of a country that was hosting the Olympics. And Beijing actually allowed some events to be held in Hong Kong. The equestrian events were held there. So 2008, another year of the rat, was a moment when I think a lot of people felt the one country, two systems is kind of working. 2020 is a time, because there was both the one country and the two systems part. 2020, with COVID bringing into sharp relief, has been a way in which I think a lot of locals are feeling that there's a downside to the one country, and the two systems part isn't providing them with much protection or buffering.
Yeah, it's great. You know, I want to talk about the word colony, because the word colony comes up in your book quite often, because of course, from the early 19th century onward up to 1997, Hong Kong was a colony of Britain. But I'm wondering now to what extent it may still be applicable as a way of thinking about Hong Kong, maybe not from our perspectives, but from the perspectives of maybe many people in Hong Kong. Do they now feel like they are a colony of another political entity? Is that a useful concept, or is that something that is really not applicable?
I think it's a useful concept, and I think one of the things that historians have been so good at in different parts of the world in the last decades is showing that empires take many forms, and there are many forms of colonial or quasi-colonial rule. And so, to some extent, Beijing's policies toward Tibet and Xinjiang have turned them into colony-like settings in one way or another. During when the Japanese Empire existed, sometimes places were left nominally under the control of local authorities, of the local ethnicity or nationality, and yet there was a colony-like relationship. And I know you and I were at a conference once, very memorable, on Japanese control of Shanghai during World War II. And Japan presented itself as freeing Shanghai from colonial rule, from British and French colonial rule, and yet imposed something that felt to many people like colony-like structure, where now there were local authorities taking their cues from Tokyo. And I think right now, though it's certainly a different setting than under the kind of formal British colonial rule, I think many people feel a colonial-like relationship, and the movement is becoming like an anti-colonial movement. And these can take a very long time and take many different forms.
Now, that's a very interesting response. I mean, that feeling, at least among some in Hong Kong, that they are colonial subjects it remains powerful. One of my dear friends in this world is James Scott, who was professor of political science at Yale University. He actually started out on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin, which is when I first interacted with him. But he's written so many important and influential books. It just forces us to rethink a lot of the things that we assume to be true. And he wrote a very famous book, the book I like the most by Jim Scott, Weapons of the Weak. It's called Weapons of the Weak. I know you know the book. And he's talking about grassroots, bottom-up kinds of political activity, protest activity, but among people who don't have, tanks and guns and things of that sort. And so he calls them weapons of the weak. That is to say, people who have grievances, people who are unhappy about whatever social, political, economic conditions. He's trying to argue in his book, they have weapons. He's talking about the whole world. Doesn't really focus on China. But the periods that you talk about in the book, again, this is part of the China Throughlines, 1919 student movement, 1989 student movement, and then Hong Kong during the Umbrella movement and the Occupy Central, and then the 2019 movements. To what extent are we seeing here? I mean, let me just ask you point blank. What kinds of weapons do these weak protesters have, whether it's China in 1919, 89, and so on, right up to Hong Kong? Is that a foolish concept that we shouldn't think about it, or do they in fact have some kinds of weapons?
So that's a great question, and I can't claim James Scott as a friend. I've met him and been impressed with him. I got to serve on a panel with him, which was a highlight actually of my career. But he is one of my academic heroes, and I think he's been consistently creative and illuminating. I also think about him a lot recently, now feeling that I may not be able to continue going to China. And he spent a long time studying places that he was unable to go, and is an inspiring in that sense too, of continuing academic work when political life throws curves in your way. I think Weapons of the Week is a great way to think about this. Because anti-colonial movements and other kinds of movements, it's a David and Goliath story where the other side has the most powerful, obvious weapons. But one kind of weapon of the week that's been used it was used in Shanghai in the pre-49 period and in Hong Kong recently, is economic choices that you make, whether it's boycotting goods from a certain place, or in Hong Kong recently, what's called the yellow economy, supporting businesses that show themselves as supportive of the movement, as a way of showing your political views for something like where you choose to eat, which is a great kind of very quintessentially Hong Kong thing to do. And it's called the yellow economy because the umbrella movement was associated with the color yellow. And so there's this idea of supporting places that support you. Another kind of Weapons of the Week thing was it became illegal to put up posters that had certain kinds of slogans on them. And there were these colored paper Lenin walls that were put up all around Hong Kong during the umbrella movement, especially in 2019. And so you didn't know what slogan you put on it would get you in trouble. So people started holding up blank pieces of colored paper. Mm-hmm. So this was a way of saying, thumbing your nose at the authorities while doing something that didn't actually necessarily cross line, though the authorities wouldn't even, where it showed that it really got to them because they started banning even holding up blank pieces of paper. Yeah. So I think James Scott and also some of the people who've written about Eastern Europe under communism, things like jokes are another kind of weapon of the week. Wordplay in Cantonese, making up new characters that show police combined with triads to suggest the police are in league with gangsters. So there's a lot of very clever kinds of small forms of subversion, which I think was what he had in mind.
Well, this raises the whole question of technology, for example. To what extent is technology a weapon of the week? And I'm thinking now of the internet. I'm thinking now of, iPhones, FaceTime, because it seems to me that a lot of the organizational aspect of bringing people together at different places for a different time, it's all done in this kind of way by young people who really know how to use their technology. So, so part of my question is, should we consider technology as an aspect of a weapon of the week for protesters and young people? And then we'll raise the question of, will the Great Firewall of China eventually go up around Hong Kong so that you cannot get access to the international internet, that it'll be like, being in China itself and having to deal with the firewall. So would you comment on those things in terms of Hong Kong?
Yeah, it's really another set of important questions. I mean, one of the things with the new technologies that I get struck by is all the way back to 1919, protesters in different places were aware of what protesters of the same generation were doing. So in China, May 4th activists knew that in Korea, there was a March 1st movement that was against Japanese imperialism. And they sometimes tried to urge each other on by saying, Korea is a colony, and yet people are taking to the streets shouldn't we show our mettle by taking to the streets when we have more room to maneuver? But the way news would circulate from Korea to China then was fairly slow, things like telegrams. And you didn't have these powerful images. One of the things in later periods, 1989, protesters could see what protesters in other places were doing, sometimes by satellite television broadcasts. But now we're just saturated with images from place to place, and that allows protesters to pick up tactics and strategies from each other very quickly. And young protesters in different parts of the world communicate with each other on Facebook. So Joshua Wong and Greta Thunberg, very different kinds of youth activists are urging each other on via social media. And protesters in Thailand saw images of what protesters in Hong Kong were doing and adapt strategies there. Protesters in Hong Kong in 2014 knew what protesters in Taiwan were doing. So new media, and they can communicate, they can pass on ideas, they can pass on images. So new media can embolden protesters, can speed up the flow of tactics. And we see this in the United States with Black Lives Matter as well, and the flow across places and influence, mutual influence. All of that is on the side of the protesters. At the same time, the new technologies give the authorities new technologies of surveillance, facial recognition, all kinds of things that can track down protesters. Protesters in Hong Kong now are very concerned about the authorities taking their cell phones from them when they're arrested and looking through their contacts and connecting other people, endangering people. People are worried that social media posts they did in the past can be used as evidence against them. So it's a kind of cat and mouse game always. Whenever there's a new technology, it gives protesters new weapons, but it also gives the authorities new weapons. So it's weapons of the weak and weapons of the powerful. And watching the internet is exactly the thing to watch, how the Great Firewall seeps in, or to what extent that happens. And it's bit by bit. It won't happen all at once. It is one way that I think businesses can push back and say, we just can't operate in one reason that some businesses can operate in Hong Kong is because they can have more access to information. So maybe there'll be a slow process there. The Communist Party has gone very quickly and very slow in Hong Kong, quickly in some realms, slowly in others. And I think the internet may be one where it's kind of a slow diminishment process.
I also go to Hong Kong fairly often, and one thing I've noticed there over the years is the arrival of people from mainland China who then settle down in Hong Kong. And this would include academics and journalists and business people and students and so forth. And the number, it seems to me, just keeps on growing. And you do make a reference to this in the book. And I wonder about the attitudes of these people. I mean, can we say that all of these people from mainland China, they have exactly the same kind of attitude about the protesters? Or can we say, you need to break it down. You need to talk about younger people or middle-aged people or older people, or you need to break it down according, are they students, are they business people, what are they? I think you mentioned at one point in the book that there were people from mainland China in Hong Kong living there who felt looked down upon, that somehow they weren't getting the respect that was, deserved and so forth. But in general, I'm interested in because the number is growing. It's not a small number anymore. There are quite a few people in Hong Kong who are actually originally from mainland China, and they're making their homes in Hong Kong now. What kinds of attitudes do these people express about what's been going on since 2014, certainly?
So it's a very varied group. I think to making room for diversity of opinion is crucial. And I think that's important, and it's an important message for the protesters, some of whom are very aware of this. But to broad brush stereotype people from the mainland isn't going to work. I mean, one of the things about Hong Kong identity is it's been very fluid, and people have been able to become part of Hong Kong. I mean, Nathan Law, who's one of the first political exiles from Hong Kong, is from a family that he was born on the mainland and then moved over when he was young and became quintessentially a Hong Kong activist. I know of some recent arrivals from the mainland who were quite sympathetic to the protests. I also know of ones who were very alienated from it, in part because of a sense that they were being looked down upon, or being exposed to different media. if the media you're taking in, and we know this in the United States, you can be in a media bubble in Hong Kong, in which all you see are the official images that only play up the violence by protesters and don't show the police violence, or you can be in a media environment where you're very aware of the police violence, and that'll affect how you see it. There are also people who can claim Hong Kong identity who are not ethnically Chinese at all, and that's a real difference in Hong Kong that hasn't been true of the mainland. And you can be somebody of South Asian descent or European descent and claim to be a Hong Konger in a way that you can't really be claimed to be Chinese. And that's one of the ways that also Hong Kong's on the brink, that special sense of a Hong Kong identity. But I think we need to make generation, class, all of this is different, and also whether people speak Cantonese or not. I think recent arrivals from mainland or speak Cantonese, when I do campus events on Hong Kong, sometimes the question, and I loved getting this question, I wanted the person to come to all the events, would say, I've heard you talk about mainland students and Hong Kong students, but I feel left out because I'm from a Cantonese speaking part of the mainland, and I feel a part of both these stories. So I think it's important to keep those people in mind too.
Very interesting. A couple of more. One is very quickly, the extradition law. It was, or so it appears, withdrawn. But I wonder whether that's likely to come back. Is that likely to be an issue that's going to resurface? This is the idea that somebody can be arrested in Hong Kong and then sent to the mainland for prosecution and so on and so forth. Is that likely to be such a hot issue that it's not going to come back? Or are you pretty confident, no, that will come back? And if it comes back, do you think foreign visitors to Hong Kong have to worry about being detained and maybe sent off to mainland China for criminal processes?
So I think it has come back. I mean, I think it's just come back under a different name. The national security law that was imposed by Beijing went into effect the end of June, really makes people vulnerable in precisely the way that the 2019 extradition law would have made them vulnerable. And we're already seeing it with the 12 who were trying to flee Hong Kong and then have been held in Shenzhen without access to lawyers, with all the things that are feared about the mainland judicial system. And one of the biggest parts of the two systems was always that Hong Kong courts had a degree of independence that was totally unlike anything on the mainland. So the national security law makes foreigners vulnerable too. And it makes us vulnerable for the things we say about Hong Kong, even outside of Hong Kong, potentially. So it's kind of the extradition bill on steroids, in effect. It really, it's a very worrisome thing, very worrisome.
Well, I want to ask you about the implications of everything that's been unfolding in Hong Kong for Taiwan. Because I mentioned I had been in Hong Kong in early October last year, and this was the run-up to the presidential elections in Taiwan. And, before everything began to unfold in Hong Kong, the most recent student movement of 2019 and young people, citizens of Hong Kong, worried. There was concern that the election in Taiwan could be very close. But then once all of these things began to unfold, I said to myself, standing on the ground in Hong Kong and looking at what I was looking at, I'm saying, this is going to get played. No coverage of it was taking place on the mainland whatsoever. No news coverage. But in in Taiwan, the news media were saturated with, hey, take a look. What's it going to be like if we're part of the PRC? Just take a look at these news reports. And then I traveled to Taiwan, and of course the election, in fact, turned out to be a landslide for the Minjindang party. and a big loss for the Nationalist Party, which is the party that the Communist Party used to hate and now loves more and more. They love to see them back in power in Taiwan. So this is a very serious question, because the government in China, in Beijing, very much has its eye on Taiwan, which is a much bigger, much more complicated kind of situation. And I'm wondering whether everything that's been happening in Hong Kong and then the Chinese government response to it is going to be counterproductive when it comes to the issue of Taiwan. Is this going to make it more difficult? And if so, in what ways for there to be any progress made from the Beijing point of view on reuniting Taiwan with the rest of China?
I think you're absolutely right that it's making it harder. And it's interesting to go back. When the one country, two systems idea was first floated in the 80s about Hong Kong, the idea was quite explicitly, hey, Taiwan, watch what happens to Hong Kong. Watch what a light touch we can have. This could be your future. You could become part of the PRC, but as a special administrative region. You could maintain your own culture and way of life the way we're going to let Hong Kongers maintain their culture and way of life. So the idea was, hey, Taiwan, watch Hong Kong. This could be your future. By 2014, when I was in Hong Kong during the umbrella movement, I saw a big banner that I remember made a deep impression on me that said, Taiwan, beware, exclamation point. Our today could be your tomorrow. So it was turning that old kind of promise into a threat. I mean, just watch, look what they're doing to us, taking control. So I think but I think the other part of so I think it is making it harder. It's alienating. It undermines the idea that you can be absorbed into the PRC and still really maintain a high degree of autonomy. Tibet couldn't do it. I mean, there was a warning sign in the 50s. Tibet went from being promised a lot of autonomy to that going away after 10 years. In Hong Kong, it's taken a little longer, but again, it's gone away. And people in Taiwan are very savvy about this, a lot of them. The other thing, though, I think about this is the international community really should be making a lot of noise about Hong Kong, should be really making it clear to the Chinese Communist Party that we're watching and we're concerned about this. Because if the international community doesn't really care about Hong Kong, that will worry us about Taiwan. Because one thing that that keeps Beijing from making aggressive moves toward Taiwan, in a worst case scenario, military ones, is an idea that there would be this incredible outrage internationally, the United States, but also other places. And so I think that's a reason to really show that the world is paying attention to events in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang, where horrific human rights abuses are taking place, because it's a way of putting the Chinese Communist Party at least a bit on notice that we do care about this, that we pay attention to it, that there is not just carte blanche. And that's hard because the world is so distracted and we have so many deep problems of our own to deal with. But even at this moment, I think we should be showing that we care and are paying attention.
Well, I want to thank Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom of the University of California, Irvine, for joining us today on China Throughlines. The new book is called Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, and I strongly recommend this book. Hong Kong is an extremely important question that everyone should be paying attention to, and what you'll find in the book is very, very enlightening. In my opinion, it's a must read. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. These have been great questions.